They didn't burn the witches for what they did. They burned them for who they were. A fire didn't have to be lit to start a witch trial. All it took was a whisper, a turned back, a door that never opened again. In 17th-century England, suspicion came with the frost, and fear slept beside the hearth. The trials didn't begin in courtrooms. They began in kitchens, in fields, on doorsteps, and the unremarkable silences of ordinary lives. Welcome to Boring Boris History. I'm Boris, and tonight, beneath the hush of distant thunder and soft rain, we're stepping into a quiet nightmare, the kind of history that doesn't scream, but whispers you awake at 3 a.m. This is the story of what it really meant to be a witch in the 1600s. Not the spells, not the cauldrons, just the reality. Cold, slow, and quietly brutal. Let's begin with the life of a woman before she was ever called a witch.
Imagine yourself in a timber-framed cottage, wind creaking through the thatch. The fire is low, too low, but wood is scarce and money scarcer still. You're wrapped in a wool shawl, hand-mended and threadbare. Your hands raw from work. You live alone now. Your husband died last spring, not suddenly, but slowly. 1 week of coughing, then another, until the silence was permanent. You buried him with your last coins. The village didn't help much. They said prayers, then they moved on. You're no longer a wife. You're a widow. That word carries weight. It means solitude. It means fewer visits. It means you eat less, speak less, smile less. It means you don't belong. Not to the married women, not to the young girls, and certainly not to the men. You walk to the well alone. You sell eggs alone. You say good night to no one. And now you're being watched. It starts subtly. A pause in conversation when you pass, a door that doesn't open when you knock, a child told not to touch your skirt. You've changed, they say, grown strange. You still visit the grave too often. You mutter when you think no one hears. You carry dried rosemary in your apron. That's not normal, they whisper. But what is normal now that you're invisible? In 1600s England, there was no real place for a woman on her own. Marriage was structure. Husband was identity. Without him, you became something else, something outside the lines. The state didn't care much for single women unless they were wealthy, and you weren't. You had no land, no sons. Your house was barely yours. You were a guest in your own life.
And the weather wasn't helping. Winters were harsh. The so-called Little Ice Age meant colder seasons and shorter harvests. Crops failed. Animals died. People needed explanations. Blame doesn't fall on kings or clergy. Blame falls on the woman at the edge of the village who has no one to protect her. That woman is you. You still tend a small garden, a few herbs, bitter greens. You've always known which leaves help a fever, which roots settle a stomach. Your husband used to say you had the touch. That was a compliment once. Now it's a warning. They've started to ask questions. Not directly. No one accuses yet, but questions hover. A baby fell ill last week. Did you look at it strangely? A cow gave sour milk. Did it graze near your field? A man limped past your home. Did he cross your threshold? There's no proof, only fear. And that fear grows like mold on damp stone, quietly, thoroughly, and in the dark. You try to stay polite. You lower your eyes. You stop offering remedies, but the damage is already done. In a small village, memories are long and forgiveness is short. And then, someone sees your cat. Just a cat, black perhaps, or grey, or missing an ear. It doesn't matter. It follows you sometimes, or sits by your door. That's all it takes. Someone remembers a story their grandmother told, something about familiars, a devil in animal form. They say your cat speaks to you. They say it feeds on your blood. They say you feed on theirs. You try to explain. Of course you do. But explanations are like wind against stone. They don't leave a mark.
And what's worse, the children start to stare. They've been told not to play near your fence, but they do. Children don't understand fear, only the shape of it. One throws a stone, another mocks your voice. They laugh, but it isn't joy, it's rehearsal. One day they'll testify. You shut your door, you stay inside, you become what they say you are, alone, silent, and strange. And it's only a matter of time, because all it takes is one bad harvest, one stillbirth, one merchant losing a wagon wheel near your gate, and someone respected, says your name in the wrong tone. Then the whispers become a knock, and that knock, when it comes, won't be polite.
Imagine yourself in a village so small you could walk from one edge to the other in under an hour, where everyone knows your name, your family, your debts, and what you planted last spring. The world beyond the fields barely exists. There is no anonymity here, no quiet solitude that isn't carefully noted by watchful eyes. You are not a stranger in this place. You are known. And in the 1600s, being known did not mean being safe. It meant every gesture, every word, every silence could become fuel for the slow-burning fire of suspicion. Life in such a village moved to the rhythm of necessity. You rise with the sun, pull water from the well, tend to what few possessions you have. If you're a widow, especially one without sons, you may have a single pig, a patch of garden, and little else. The work is relentless. And yet, even in your poverty, you must maintain appearances. Bread must be baked. Clothes must be mended. A smile must be offered to neighbours, even as your stomach turns from hunger, because in this place, to deviate is to be noticed, and to be noticed is dangerous. The social order of your village is rigid. The church warden watches from the pews. The constable watches from the edge of every gathering. The local gossip, that invisible network of surveillance, moves faster than any priest's sermon. If your husband drank himself into an early grave, that's noted. If your daughter moved to a neighbouring village and never wrote back, that's noted. If your herbs grow especially well while your neighbour's cow sickens, especially that. People seek explanations. They fear what they don't understand. Misfortune, be it a crop that fails or a child that dies suddenly, is never just misfortune. It's punishment, or witchcraft, or both. And someone must be blamed.
It rarely falls on the strong or the well-connected. No, accusations tend to drift downhill, gathering speed until they collide with those least able to defend themselves. You.
The path to suspicion is rarely dramatic. It begins in whispers. Someone mentions that your cat is always nearby when misfortune strikes. Another claims they saw you walking in the woods at dusk. You've been alone too long, they say. You never quite fit in. You are always peculiar. The women who once shared bread with you now share sideways glances. The men speak more softly when you pass. The children keep their distance. This is not paranoia. This is survival. You try to act normal, but what does that mean anymore? Too quiet, and they say you're brooding. Too loud, and you're hiding guilt. You go to church. Too often, they say you're faking. Miss a Sunday, they call you godless. You speak up for yourself, and that becomes arrogance. You stay silent, and that's secrecy. There is no right move. Every gesture becomes evidence, every word twisted into a shape that fits their fear. Even your home is no refuge. If your door creaks too loudly, someone might say it's a portal for spirits. If your window sticks, perhaps that's where your familiar slipped through. A spoon dropped becomes a sign. A dream remembered is a confession. You find yourself watching yourself, second-guessing your own behavior, trying to remain within an ever-shrinking circle of acceptability. The worst part is, the people who now glance at you with suspicion were once your neighbors, your friends. You held their babies. You wept at their funerals. But fear has no loyalty. Fear rewrites memory. Where once there was a kind gesture, they now recall a strange look. Where you once gave healing herbs, they now imagine curses. And perhaps, in the back of their minds, there is a small unspoken comfort in watching your fall. Because if the devil walks among them, better that he's in your cottage than theirs. The local preacher might be new to town, young and eager to prove himself righteous. His sermons begin to sound more pointed. He speaks of serpents hiding among the wheat, of wolves in sheep's clothing. He does not name you, but you feel the congregation's eyes shift your way as he speaks. You kneel during prayer, but your heart pounds, and when you rise, the space around you feels colder than before. One day, a stranger arrives, perhaps a minor official, perhaps someone calling himself a witch finder. He is not from your village. He does not know you, but he listens closely to those who do. He speaks with quiet authority. He assures the townspeople that evil can be rooted out if only they cooperate. He asks questions with the calm detachment of a man accustomed to hearing lies. He writes down what they say, every oddity, every argument, every unexplained sickness. You are not arrested, not yet, but you are being watched more closely now, and worse, you know it. Every morning you rise wondering whether today will be the day they come. Every night you go to bed listening for footsteps. Your dreams turn restless. You speak less. You pray more.
You look at your hands and wonder how they came to look like this. Knotted, worn, and somehow guilty. And through it all, life goes on. The baker bakes, the blacksmith hammers, the children play, though never near your door. Life moves forward, indifferent to your isolation. That is perhaps the cruelest part, not the accusation, but the quiet that surrounds it. You're not condemned yet, that you are no longer part of the village either. You've become a shadow in your own life, waiting, watching, wondering which whisper will be the one that ends it all. And it will end, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a knock on the door. A simple piece of parchment, a summons. Your name written in ink that might as well be blood. No one will meet your eyes as you are led away, and as the door closes behind you, the village will exhale, comforted by the illusion that evil has been identified and removed. But it was never about evil, it was about fear. And in a village like yours, fear doesn't need proof, it only needs a name.
Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a forest, the basket in your hand heavy with roots, moss, and dried leaves. You've walked these paths your entire life. You know which plants soothe fever, which leaves reduce swelling, and which flowers can calm a colicky child. This knowledge wasn't taught in books, it was passed down, whispered from mother to daughter, or learned by necessity, sometimes in desperation. In another world, perhaps this would make you valuable. But here, in this century and in this village, it makes you dangerous. You are not a midwife by trade, but you've delivered babies. You are not a physician, but you've helped the sick when no doctor would come. Your hands are steady, your tone calm, your remedies sometimes more effective than the prayers offered by the priest. And that is the problem. The people who once relied on you in secret are the same who now look over their shoulders when they see you coming. Gratitude fades. Suspicion lingers. In this world, women who know too much become a threat. A woman who lives alone, who doesn't remarry after her husband's death, who has no children to soften her image. That woman is outside the expected order. She becomes unnatural. Even her survival becomes suspect. How does she eat? Who helps her chop firewood? Is it not odd, they whisper, that she manages on her own? What exactly is sustaining her? You notice over time that your visits are no longer welcomed. People avert their gaze. Children are pulled inside. The woman who once sent for your help during a hard birth now crosses herself when you pass. You begin to wonder whether it was worth helping them. But you know the answer. Survival was never about fairness. It was about enduring each day without giving them more reasons to hate you. Sometimes the accusations begin with something small. An animal falling ill after crossing your path, a spoiled batch of beer, a cow that births a still calf. People look for patterns, and once they see one, they see them everywhere. Your black shawl becomes a sign. Your cat, a mouser and nothing more, becomes a demonic familiar. The candle that flickers strangely in your window is seen not as a draught, but as a signal.
They connect dots that were never there, and suddenly you are no longer just an old woman with herbs. You are something else entirely, something to be feared. You remember the girl from 2 villages over, young, quiet, and clever with her hands. She made dolls from corn husks and could mimic bird calls. When a fever swept through and 3 children died, someone pointed to her. She had been seen dancing barefoot at dusk. That was enough. She was taken. You never heard what happened next, but you saw the empty hut and you understood. You tell yourself that you are different, that you are older, that people know you, that you have done good. But deep down, you feel the shift. Your name, once spoken casually, is now whispered. You see people crossing themselves after speaking with you. The silence around your cottage grows thicker each week. And worst of all, you begin to doubt yourself. Not your innocence, but your ability to survive this. There are no trials yet, no tortures or shouts, but the village has begun its ritual older than any law, the slow unspooling of someone from the fabric of the community. First, they erase your virtue, then your humanity. Then, when you are only a symbol, they act. And they always act under the belief that they are protecting themselves.
Your dreams become strange. You hear your name spoken in empty rooms. You wake before dawn and sit by the fire waiting for the sun to return. You begin to feel like a ghost in your own life. Like a story the village has already started telling, even though the ending hasn't happened yet. You are no longer living to thrive. You are living not to be noticed, not to be remembered, as if shrinking your presence could make you vanish from their minds. But it doesn't work. One day, you are walking back from the stream and see 3 children staring at your door. They are whispering, giggling, pointing. One of them runs when he sees you. The others stand their ground. They are not afraid of you. They are afraid of what you represent. And in that moment, you understand something chilling. The village has already passed judgment. They are simply waiting for someone with authority to make it official. And that someone is coming. Perhaps it's the traveling preacher, tall and hollow-eyed, who speaks of devils with such conviction you feel them in the air. Perhaps it's the magistrate with his thin lips and heavy ring. Perhaps it's just your neighbor, the one who needs your land. They will come, and they will not come alone. The healer, the widow, the outcast. 3 roles you never asked for. 3 roles that overlap so closely in this world that they become indistinguishable from the image of the witch. You wear none of these labels on your skin, but that doesn't matter. Others have written them for you, carved not in flesh, but in gossip, in fear, in the ancient need to blame. You are not evil, you are not a threat, but you have become a story. And once that story takes root, it becomes harder to uproot than any weed in your garden.
The day it begins is unremarkable. A morning like any other. A light mist hangs over the fields, chimney smoke rises in lazy spirals, and the village is waking slowly to the rhythms it has always known. And yet, you know something is different. You can feel it. The silence near your door is thicker. The birds seem to avoid your eaves. You notice 2 women talking near the well, heads close together, casting brief glances toward your window. You are no longer a woman with a name. You are her, and her is all they need to know. There is no summons, no official charge, not at first, just questions, subtle ones, from the baker's wife asking if she'd seen her missing comb, from the stable boy wondering if you'd passed near the pasture where the colt twisted its leg. They aren't accusations, not yet, but they plant the seeds. You sense it clearly now. The community is not wondering if you are a witch. They are quietly gathering the reasons why. It escalates like the coming of a storm, slowly, then all at once. A new preacher arrives, one who speaks with fire in his voice and dread in his eyes. He warns of unclean women who consort with the devil, who wear the skin of the familiar and poison the lambs of God. He doesn't name you. He doesn't have to. People fill in the blanks. You hear his sermons from afar. The wind carries his words to your door like a curse. There are wolves in the shape of widows. Soon a child claims to have dreamed of you, standing at the foot of her bed, eyes glowing like coals. A dog whimpers when you walk past. The wind knocks a shutter loose in the schoolhouse, and someone says your name. Everything becomes connected. Your every movement retold, reinterpreted, rewritten to fit the shape of their fear.
You don't sleep much anymore. You keep the fire going through the night, even when the wood runs low. You speak aloud to yourself, not out of madness, but to fill the silence. You are afraid that if you don't say your name, you might forget who you were before they began calling you something else. Then comes the knock at the door. 2 men stand outside, one in rough wool, the other with a seal dangling from his belt. They say they have questions. You are not under arrest, they assure you. This is not a formal inquiry, but they look inside your house, at your dried herbs, at the worn wooden doll by the window, at the bottle of lye by the hearth. Everything is suspicious if you look long enough. Everything is witchcraft if you name it as such. They ask if you've ever cursed someone, if you know the names of the saints, if you've had strange dreams, if animals seem to follow you. You answer with calm dignity, but your calmness is noted as unrepentant. Your knowledge of saints becomes evidence of mimicry. Your solitude is now proof of secret rituals. The interview ends, but the verdict has already been written. The villagers avoid your eyes as you pass, even the ones who once asked you for healing, especially them. To defend you would be to risk guilt by association, and so the world begins to close around you. One morning you are taken, not with violence, but with finality. They come not as a mob, but as a procession, a legal formality cloaked in quiet dread. You are walked through your own village like a funeral, though you are still breathing. The children are kept inside. The adults pretend to be busy. No one speaks your name aloud. The holding cell is cold, not a dungeon, just a stone room in the lower part of the manor. But the walls weep with damp, and the straw smells of rot. They leave you there not out of cruelty,
but out of neglect. You are not important enough to hate, only to eliminate. Quietly, efficiently.
They bring you before a small group, a local magistrate, 2 men of the cloth, and a clerk whose pen scratches like rain against dry leaves. They ask you if you believe in God, if you've flown in dreams, if you've ever awoken with scratches on your arms. They show you a birthmark on your leg and ask if it speaks to you. The absurdity is overwhelming, but you say nothing. Your words are no longer your own. They will be taken, twisted, and rewritten to fit the story that has already been decided. They ask if you confess. To what, you wonder silently? To being poor, to being lonely, to surviving without permission. And then they say something that chills your blood more than the stone beneath your feet. If you confess, you may be spared. Not spared entirely. Your name will still be ruined, your life erased. But perhaps you won't hang. Perhaps exile. Perhaps a distant convent. Perhaps. You say nothing, because to confess is to participate in their fiction, to agree that you were the story they told about you. And so they proceed. They speak of rope and gallows, of public decency, of protecting the innocent. Your death will be clean, orderly, and officially recorded. And no one will remember that you once nursed their fevers, delivered their children, or fed the orphan in the lane. Those stories don't get written down. But someone may remember. Perhaps a child now grown who recalls the warmth of your hands on a burning forehead. Perhaps a neighbor whose conscience will stir at the sight of the noose. Or perhaps, in the hush of a rainy night, someone will pass your empty cottage and wonder, who lived there? What did she do to deserve such an end? And in that moment, for just a breath, your story will be yours again. Imagine yourself living in a land that no longer feels anchored. The year is 1645, and England is caught in a civil war not just of politics, but of identity. The monarchy has fractured. The church is split between old rituals and Puritan fire. Neighbours no longer trust neighbours. Armies march through the countryside not as distant echoes, but as real shadows, devouring harvests and leaving smoke in their wake. There is no king in London. There is no pope in Canterbury. There is only fear, and fear always looks for a name to wear. In the eastern counties of England, this fear becomes dense. Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk, places of open farmland and scattered villages, are fertile ground not just for props, but for suspicion. Communities are small, memory is long, and difference is noticed. The Civil War has drained local authority. Magistrates are unsure. The gentry are either away fighting or too cautious to interfere. The old structures that once held order, noble families, bishops, travelling judges, have thinned. And into that vacuum steps a man with certainty. But before we speak his name, let's stay in the fog a little longer. The people of East Anglia are not inherently cruel, but they are tired. Their crops are failing. Disease has passed through more than once in recent years. The war takes sons and gives little in return. Prices are unstable, and the market towns feel unsafe. Superstition, once the domain of old wives' tales, begins to seep into official thinking. If a cow dies, it was bewitched. If a child coughs blood, it is a curse. And if a woman lives alone beyond a certain age and speaks with confidence, then perhaps she is the cause of both. You feel it in the sermons. The clergy, especially the rising Puritan preachers, are increasingly obsessed with the devil, not as metaphor, but as a real, moving, active force in the world. They speak of Satan's agents walking among the people, cloaked in the flesh of ordinary folk. They speak of spiritual warfare, of cleansing sin, of rooting out hidden evils. The idea of witches no longer belongs only to folklore, it becomes civic duty to identify them.
What makes this era different is that fear is no longer private, it becomes public policy. In a village near Manningtree, the birthplace of what is to come, a few accusations take root. Children fall ill, livestock turns lame, a man's wife is said to have been troubled by dreams, and then there's a name. Elizabeth Clark, an old widow with one leg and a sharp tongue. She is questioned, she is pressed, she is watched. She is the first. And watching her trial is a young man with no official authority, no title, no post, no appointment from church or crown, but with an unmistakable presence. He dresses well, he speaks calmly, and he claims to have a mission. His name is Matthew Hopkins. Hopkins is not a judge. He is not a minister. He has no formal legal background, but he arrives with papers that seem official and a manner that commands respect. He calls himself the Witch-Finder General, a title he invented, but one that others begin to use. And in a time of chaos, what people crave more than peace is clarity. Hopkins offers that. He is not loud. He is not wild-eyed. He does not rant like some traveling preachers. Instead, he presents himself as rational. He claims to have studied witchcraft. He says he knows the signs, and he begins to explain to the authorities that there is a way to find the truth, a method to the madness. That method, however, is as cruel as it is calculated. Hopkins introduces a system. He inspects bodies for witches' marks, small moles or blemishes believed to be feeding spots for familiars. He watches suspects sleep, waiting for them to whisper secrets. He uses sleep deprivation, binding, and observation. Most controversially, he authorizes the use of swimming the accused, binding them and placing them in water. If they float, it is proof that the water rejects them, proof of guilt. If they sink, they are innocent, but perhaps drowned. It is a brutal logic, but one that gains traction.
The trials begin to multiply. What started in Manningtree spreads like a controlled burn. Villages that once whispered now hold public hearings. Accusations multiply. Fear does not move in straight lines, it leaps. People name others to save themselves. Entire communities turn inward, paranoid, hollowed out by distrust. Hopkins, often accompanied by his associate John Stern, travels from town to town, conducting interrogations, charging fees, and leaving behind courtrooms filled with confession and rope. In just over a year, more than 100 people, mostly women, are hanged. Hopkins claims
he does not torture. Technically, he is correct. He avoids overt, violent instruments, but his methods, keeping women awake for days, starving them, isolating them, are a slow erosion of sanity. Many confess not because they believe themselves guilty, but because they no longer know what is real. What gives Hopkins power is not a single title. It is not royal commission or military backing. It is the convergence of timing and tone. He steps into a void. The old world is crumbling. The new world has not yet formed. He arrives with answers, cruel, clean, and final. And the courts listen. But even in his rise, there are whispers. Some magistrates grow uneasy. Some clergy question his motives. Is this about faith, or is it about money? After all, Hopkins charges towns for his services. The more witches found, the more he is paid. Some suspect he believes in witches only as much as it serves his purpose. Others believe he is sincere, but dangerously so. What is certain is this: Matthew Hopkins will leave a stain across the eastern counties of England that will not wash away for generations. He doesn't remain forever. His reign is brief, perhaps less than 2 years in total. But in that time, he will oversee more executions for witchcraft than had occurred in the previous century. He will become the face of a movement. And even after he disappears, quietly, some say, from tuberculosis, others claim suicide, the fear he amplified remains. In the next subsegment, we'll follow his most infamous trials and the machinery of fear that supported them, how entire communities were swept into silence, and how justice became theatre.
Imagine the village green, not as a place of gathering, but of quiet dread. A scaffold is being constructed, wooden beams joined by crude iron nails, its shape familiar even before the rope is tied. Children are not playing today. They stand close to their mothers, eyes wide. The air is not festive, it is heavy. A trial is about to begin. But unlike a trial in London or Oxford, where barristers speak in polished tones and verdicts are whispered by men in robes, this is not law as you know it. This is fear turned into ritual. The witch trials of East Anglia were not merely legal proceedings. They were public performances of suspicion and submission, choreographed by men like Matthew Hopkins, and carried out with the full cooperation of a community that had forgotten how to doubt. The accused are usually women, often poor, often old, often alone. They have names like Rebecca, Alice, Elizabeth. They are known for small things, muttering when they walk, feeding a stray cat, gathering herbs, or arguing too loudly in the market. These are not crimes, but in the warped lens of 1640s England, they are no longer benign. They are signs, marks of otherness, and Hopkins knows how to interpret them. The process begins with accusation. A neighbor comes forward, sometimes honestly, sometimes under pressure, and claims that something strange has happened. A cow has died. A baby has fallen ill. A dream has left them shaken. And in the fog of causality, a name is spoken. That name becomes
a summons. The accused is brought before local justices, often under the shadow of Hopkins' presence. She is not beaten, she is not whipped, but she is kept awake, questioned for hours, denied food, watched by night. Every breath, every glance, every twitch of her fingers is noted. If she speaks of God, it is tested. If she prays too quickly, it is rehearsed. If she falters, it is guilt.
Hopkins' method is not loud, but relentless. He believes, or pretends to believe, that witches consort with spirits called familiars. These are said to appear in dreams or in waking form, taking shapes like cats, toads, or even insects. The accused are asked to name their familiars. If they hesitate, it is a sign. If they speak, it is confession. One woman, Elizabeth Clark, already lame and widowed, is said to have confessed under Hopkins' interrogation. Her confession is not linear, it spirals. She speaks of a man in black, of small creatures with human voices, of promises whispered in the night. These confessions are often surreal, dreamlike, but they are taken as truth. And worse, they implicate others. This is the machinery of guilt. One confession births another. Names multiply. Friends are drawn in. Wives, midwives, cunning women. The network of the accused expands not because of evidence, but because fear compels it. The only way to escape the rope is to name someone else. The trials themselves are swift. Judges, sometimes local, sometimes brought in, hear the confessions. Witnesses are called. They speak of odd behavior, of unexplained events. Sometimes they recount dreams. Sometimes they swear they saw the accused speak to animals. The line between imagination and testimony blurs, and no one questions it. There are no defense attorneys. There is no presumption of innocence. Once accused, the burden is yours to prove the negative, that you are not in league with Satan. But how does one prove they did not consort with a spirit, that their birthmark is just a mark, that their nightmares are only dreams? In many cases, the accused confess, not because they believe it, but because exhaustion wins. Days without sleep, constant questions, the watching eyes of neighbors, the weight of a world already convinced of your guilt. They say what is expected. They speak the names, and the cycle continues. When a guilty verdict is reached, and it usually is, the execution is public. Hangings, not burnings. The latter is a common myth in England, but the effect is the same. The body swings, the village watches, and order is restored, for now. But the damage is deep. Families are shattered, land is seized, children are left motherless, and a quiet precedent is set. Suspicion is safer than dissent. Those who question the process risk joining the condemned, and so silence spreads like fog. Hopkins, through all of this, maintains his posture. He does not scream, he does not strike. He points, he nods, he suggests. His authority is built on implication. He claims divine mission, but collects earthly payment. His reputation grows, not just as a man, but as a method. In town after town, the pattern repeats. Manningtree, Bury St. Edmunds, Chelmsford. Dozens hanged, hundreds accused. The calendar pages turn, but the pattern remains fixed. The war rages in the background,
But the real battle between fear and reason is being waged in parish halls and village greens. By the end of 1646, whispers of doubt begin to emerge. A few clergy speak out. Some towns resist his fees. A pamphlet appears questioning his authority. And then, just as quickly as he rose, Hopkins disappears from the records. He dies young, perhaps of tuberculosis. Some say the devil took him. Others say he simply fell ill. The witch-finder general is gone, but the fear he conjured lingers. In our next subsegment, we will examine the so-called evidence used in these trials, the folklore, the beliefs, the desperate logic that turned birthmarks into curses and cats into accomplices.
Imagine waking one morning to find a crowd at your doorstep, not with tortures, but with questions. They have come not to ask what you've done, but what marks your body bears. You are not wounded, you are not ill, but they want to see behind your ear, beneath your arm, along the back of your neck. They believe there may be something there, something small, something strange, something not quite human. In the 17th century, guilt was often etched in flesh, and nowhere was this more evident than in the pursuit of witches, where the line between superstition and law blurred to the point of vanishing. If you were accused, it didn't take much to seal your fate. A blemish, a scar, a mole, any mark that looked unusual could be interpreted as the devil's mark, a physical sign of your pact with Satan, an entry point through which your familiar spirit was said to feed. Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witch-finder general, understood this well. He did not invent these ideas. Belief in witches and devils ran deep in English folklore, but he systematized them, turned them into procedure. The search for witches' marks became an essential part of his investigations, performed with the seriousness of science and the spectacle of theater. The process was invasive and humiliating. Women were stripped and examined by midwives or watchers, often in public or semi-public settings. The watchers would look for any mark, any place where the skin seemed odd or unfeeling. A birthmark, a wart, a skin tag, a patch of discolored flesh. If found, it would be pricked with a long pin or needle. If no pain was felt, or if the mark didn't bleed, then it was said to be unnatural, proof of a compact with the devil. But the body is imperfect. Nearly every person has at least one such mark, and the tools used to test them were not always honest. Some witch prickers used retractable blades, sharp in appearance, but harmless in use. They would press the tool against the skin, the blade would slide inward, and the woman would not react, not because she was a witch, but because the needle never touched her.
Beyond the body itself, the stories told about the accused became part of the evidence. Dreams were taken as testimony. If a neighbor dreamed you cursed their cow, it could be repeated in court. If someone thought they saw a strange animal leave your home at night, it could be called a familiar. These spirits were thought to serve the witch in exchange for sustenance, usually blood drawn from the witch's body through a secret teat or mark. The names of familiars were often fantastical. In trial records, they appear with strange and playful syllables: Pie Wacket, Vinegar Tom, Grizzle Greedygut. These were not creatures of flesh, but of imagination and fear. Yet their names were recorded as seriously as those of human witnesses. If a woman confessed to knowing them, and many did, under duress, it was as good as signing her own death warrant. The evidence didn't stop at the physical or the spectral. Everyday behaviors became suspect. If you kept to yourself, you were hiding something. If you were too helpful, you were ingratiating yourself for dark reasons. If you fell out with a neighbor, and that neighbor later suffered misfortune, it was seen as retribution. The coincidence of illness or accident, especially in children or animals, was interpreted as malice cast from afar. Midwives were particularly vulnerable. Their work with birth and women's bodies put them in close contact with life and death, blood and pain, forces that many feared but did not understand. If a baby was stillborn, if a mother died in childbirth, the midwife might be blamed. Even when her hands were clean, suspicion clung to her like smoke. The records from these trials are chilling, not because of their horror, but because of their calm. Depositions are written in flat, measured language. They document absurdities without irony. A toad appeared in the window and stared. A woman muttered after church. A mark did not bleed. These were not crimes, but they became the raw material for execution.
In some cases, the accused attempted to defend themselves with logic or protest. They would explain that the mark was from a childhood injury, that they had never seen the creature described, that they were ill, not possessed. But these defenses rarely mattered. Once accused, their voice carried less weight than the whispers of the crowd. And so the trials churned forward. One woman accused another, one mark led to another search, one confession led to a dozen arrests. The machinery of guilt ran on fear and repetition. Hopkins did not need to invent new accusations. He simply had to press on the same bruised spot again and again until the whole village believed it hurt. What is perhaps most unsettling is how ordinary this all seemed to those involved. There was no need for torture chambers or dungeons. The fear lived in daylight, in churches and markets, in neighborly conversations turned suspicious. It lived in the eye of the watcher and the ink of the clerk, and it left behind a paper trail of broken lives. In the next subsegment, we'll turn our attention to the role of class, property, and power, how accusations of witchcraft were not just about fear or faith, but about land, inheritance, and the quiet greed of those who benefited from each hanging.
Imagine yourself as a modest landowner's widow in 1640s rural England. Your husband has been dead for a few years, and though your cottage is humble, it sits on a good plot, enough for a few goats, maybe a rented field nearby. You have no sons. You've outlived your usefulness in the eyes of the community, and someone else, maybe a wealthier neighbor or a local official, has quietly begun to take interest in what you might leave behind. That's when the rumors begin. For all the talk of the devil and spirits, the witch hunts of early modern England were not always driven by theology. Behind many of the accusations lay something more tangible: land, property, status and power. The gallows, it turned out, were not just for punishing the damned. They were for clearing obstacles. Matthew Hopkins came onto the scene during a perfect storm. Civil war was fracturing the country, Puritan fervor was spreading across towns, and local governance had become unstable. Without centralized oversight, communities were left to handle accusations themselves, and in such chaos, the rules of who got punished and who got protected quietly shifted. Matthew Hopkins styled himself as a servant of justice, but justice rarely walked alone. In village after village, a curious pattern emerged. Many of the accused were women who owned property independently or stood in the way of its transfer. A widow without a son, a spinster whose cottage sat on a valuable corner, a healer who had no husband but many loyal clients. These women were not threatening because they practiced magic. They were threatening because they had something others wanted or refused to play by the roles society assigned.
It was subtle, usually. Not a written conspiracy, but a pattern of behavior. A land dispute would simmer, a neighbor's cow would fall ill, a parish official, eager to keep the peace or please a patron, would suggest a name. The accusation would land on someone already vulnerable, already discussed in whispers. And suddenly her name would be in the records, her body would be searched, her cottage would be empty. What made it worse was how the legal and religious systems fed into each other. Local elites, magistrates, and clergy often worked in hand. A wealthy landowner might sit as a judge, while also being the beneficiary of a redistribution of land following a witch's conviction. In this way, piety became a mask for acquisition. The condemnation of witches doubled as the quiet redistribution of wealth. Even the fees involved revealed the machinery. Witch-finders like Hopkins did not work for free. They charged towns for their services, lodging, transport, examinations, even the hanging itself. These weren't always exorbitant, but they added up. If a village was already poor, it might only afford 1 or 2 accusations. If a town was wealthier, the trials could stretch on for months. Each new accusation justified further expense, which fed back into the cycle. In some cases, parishes went into debt pursuing witches. The economic implications didn't end with the trial. Once a person was executed, their property could be seized or reassigned. If there were no clear heirs, or if those heirs were underage or intimidated, nearby landowners could make quiet claims. These weren't robberies in the street, they were legal transfers, witnessed by clerks and sealed with stamps. But they were soaked in injustice. Even among those who weren't directly accused, the fear of implication could silence opposition. If you were a woman with no husband, you learned quickly not to speak too freely. If you had land, you kept your head down. If someone nearby was arrested, you stayed out of it, even if you suspected something was wrong. Silence was safer than solidarity.
And so, slowly, a village could be reshaped, not just by loss, but by absorption. Plots were consolidated. Old houses were torn down or repurposed. Those who had once been troublesome or inconvenient were no longer present to resist. Their absence wasn't mourned exactly, it was simply absorbed into the landscape. A hedge grew where their garden had been. A fence was extended. Someone else walked their path to the market. To be clear, not every accusation of witchcraft was financially motivated. Many came from genuine fear, superstition, or personal grudges.
But woven through these stories is a darker thread, that beneath the spiritual language of the witch hunts lay the very human hunger for advantage, property, power, influence. Witchcraft was the pretext, acquisition was the prize. Matthew Hopkins may not have personally profited from each individual trial, but the system he enabled and expanded allowed many others to do just that. In his wake, towns were quieter, not safer, just more aligned with the interests of those who had always wanted to redraw the village map. And when the final tolls of his witch-finding faded, many of the so-called witches were gone, but their gardens were blooming with someone else's flowers, their chairs sat by someone else's hearth, their names were only spoken in cautionary tales, warnings to others who might speak out of turn, or live a life slightly outside expectation. As we leave this segment, remember, the witch trials were never only about fear of the devil. They were about control, of belief, of behavior, and of land. And those who orchestrated the accusations did so not always with fire and pitchforks, but with contracts, signatures, and silent gains.
Imagine being told your innocence or guilt lies not in your words, nor your actions, but in your skin. That your body, without speaking, is already bearing witness against you. A bruise, a mole, a freckle. These are now more than imperfections. They are warnings, signs, symbols of something deeper, darker, and inescapable. In the world of 17th-century witch trials, the human body was not protected by privacy or dignity. It was territory to be searched, mapped, and interpreted by others. In the pursuit of witches, the body became a battlefield. It was where suspicion was confirmed, where meaning was projected, where authority exerted its control. The so-called witch's mark was not a myth left to folk tales. It was a tangible obsession, an anatomical feature that investigators were certain they could find if they only looked hard enough. And they did look, thoroughly, relentlessly, often without mercy. These searches were not metaphorical. Accused women, usually poor, older, or socially isolated, were stripped of their clothing and subjected to intense scrutiny. Their hair might be shorn, their limbs spread, their skin prodded and pierced. The purpose of this was to find what the witch hunters believed was the physical imprint of a pact with the devil, a teat or mark from which a familiar spirit would drink blood. It might be a simple mole or a skin tag, a bit of discoloration or a birthmark, but in the eyes of the accusers it was damning. Once such a mark was found, it would often be pricked with a needle to see if it bled. A normal wound would cause pain and release blood, but a devil's mark supposedly would not. This belief gave rise to an entire cottage industry of so-called witch prickers, men who travelled with sharp implements, offering their services to towns and parishes, eager to root out suspected sorcery.
The reality, of course, was far more manipulative. Some prickers used retractable blades that would appear to pierce the skin without actually doing so. Others took advantage of calluses, scar tissue, or other normal variations in sensitivity. The goal was not truth, it was confirmation.
If a mark was found that fit the theory, even barely, it became the fulcrum of the entire case. Behind this practice was a broader belief that the devil, in sealing his pact with a witch, would leave a physical sign. The idea reached deep into Christian law, combining theological anxiety with a grotesque form of forensic investigation. In a time before microbiology or dermatology, marks on the skin were interpreted through superstition and fear, rather than medical understanding. A skin lesion could be explained only through morality. You weren't just sick, you were wicked. This belief allowed courts and communities to bypass the burden of proof. After all, how could one argue against their own skin? The accused were caught in a bind. If they protested the examination, they were being obstructive. If they submitted and marks were found, they were condemned. Their body, rather than offering protection or dignity, became the site of betrayal. It is important to understand how invasive and dehumanizing this process was. The accused were not examined with care or respect. They were displayed, handled, discussed as objects. In some cases, towns hired groups of women to serve as searchers under the supervision of male officials. These women would examine their peers in what might have been an attempt to provide decency, but often turned into ritualized humiliation. The line between witness and accuser blurred, and once a mark was agreed upon, there was little hope of avoiding a guilty verdict. The absurdity of this process didn't stop the courts. In fact, it reinforced them. The more abstract and subjective the evidence, the more power it gave the examiner. Any unusual skin feature could be declared suspicious, and given that nearly every human body carries such marks, the system guaranteed a nearly infinite supply of guilt.
Perhaps even more chilling was the way in which confessions were sometimes discovered through the body. Under intense pressure, physical, emotional, or psychological, many women confessed not just to having a mark, but to feeding a familiar spirit from it. They described animals, cats, toads, ferrets, who would come in the night and suckle from their skin. These stories, though surreal, became powerful evidence in court, especially when combined with a mark found on the corresponding part of the body. Some historians argue that these confessions were less about belief and more about desperation. Trapped in a process with no exit, some accused women simply gave the interrogators what they wanted. They constructed narratives around their bodies, adopting the language of guilt to end the torment. But the moment a confession was signed or extracted, their fate was sealed. Not all cases involved fraud or torture. Sometimes communities simply believed in the significance of the skin. They saw it as a book to be read, a surface that bore the imprint of spiritual alignment. A scar was not just an old wound, it was a story of allegiance. And in a world dominated by fear of invisible enemies, the visible body became the only terrain that could be controlled, judged, and punished. And so the body was reduced to artifact, a place where guilt could be manufactured, displayed, and codified into law, a tool for others to interpret, a silent participant in its own condemnation. In the next subsegment, we'll examine how animals, real and imagined,
entered the courtroom. Cats, frogs, and birds that lived alongside accused women became central figures in trials. Through testimony and superstition, we'll see how the familiar spirit blurred the boundary between folklore and legal judgment, further tightening the noose on those who had already been marked by suspicion.
Imagine a small, hungry cat curling at your feet, rubbing against your ankle for warmth or attention. In today's world, it might be a quiet comfort, a living presence that softens the loneliness of a home or a life on the margins. But in the 1600s, that same cat might have marked you for death, especially if you were poor, especially if you were a woman, especially if you were already being watched. Because in the courts and common minds of early modern Europe, a pet was never just a pet. It could be a familiar, a demonic agent in animal form, gifted to a witch by the devil himself. In this subsegment, we step into a world where animals were cross-examined without ever speaking, where a frog in a kitchen, a toad in a garden, or a bird perched on a windowsill could become damning evidence. These were not just chance creatures. They were seen as spiritual accomplices, sent to do harm or to receive nourishment from the witch's own body. And in a time obsessed with invisible forces and moral order, that idea held terrifying weight. The belief in familiars drew from a rich tapestry of folk stories, religious doctrine, and communal fear. Though the specifics varied by region, the pattern was disturbingly familiar. A woman is accused, a search of her home is conducted, and if any small creature is found nearby, especially one with a name, suspicion hardens into accusation. Cats, particularly black ones, bore the brunt of these fears, but they were not alone. Dogs, ferrets, mice, birds, even insects were drawn into this dark net of meaning. Their natural presence in homes, especially rural and impoverished ones, was no defense. Instead, it was seen as part of the witch's unnatural affinity for the animal world, a world that, in the eyes of puritanical Europe, was meant to be ordered, tamed, and distant.
The infamous 1645 to 1647 English witch trials, led by Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, offer some of the most detailed records of familiars as courtroom evidence. In several cases, accused women allegedly confessed to keeping creatures with names like Pyewacket, Grizzle, Vinegar Tom, and Sack and Sugar. These names were not invented by prosecutors. They were drawn from the women's own supposed confessions, recorded under duress or after prolonged imprisonment. Often these women were illiterate, elderly, or mentally unwell. The names, if not fabrications, may have reflected the kind of affectionate anthropomorphism common among people who live alone with animals, calling a bird sweetie or a cat old man. But in the eyes of the court, they were unnatural, eerie, pagan, proof of a pact. Familiars weren't just passive mascots either. They were believed to have roles, sometimes to spy, sometimes to attack, sometimes to relay the witch's will, and always they were said to suckle. This belief connected directly to the witch's mark, the idea that some small, hidden part of her body was given over to this feeding. The familiar, it was said, would return regularly to drink her blood. The relationship was inverted. She did not own the animal owned her.
This reversal of nature, of power, of gender was exactly what the society feared. These testimonies and beliefs did not emerge in a vacuum. They reflected deeper tensions around power, control, and the human relationship with the natural world. In many cases, those accused of witchcraft were herbalists or midwives, women who knew how to work with plants, soothe pain, or understand birth. They were seen as too close to nature, too fluent in things that should remain mysterious. To accuse such a woman of feeding a toad with her own blood was not just a charge of demonic behavior, it was a charge of stepping outside of sanctioned knowledge, of being a woman who knew too much. Even more unsettling is how these animal associations blurred the boundary between imagination and institutional judgment. One woman, accused in Suffolk in 1645, claimed that her familiar came to her in the shape of a rabbit and whispered dark instructions into her ear. Another claimed a red cat would lie on her chest at night and drain her breath. These stories may have been confabulations, dream logic, or the desperate inventions of people too exhausted to resist interrogation, but they were recorded as truth, and once recorded, they became legal foundations.
It's easy to look back and see absurdity, to scoff at the idea that a hedgehog in a garden or a bat in a barn might send someone to the gallows. But this was not simply about animals. It was about metaphors made real. The idea of a familiar gave physical form to fear. It made the invisible pact visible. In a culture where evil was always suspected but rarely seen, the familiar gave the devil a tail, claws, and eyes. It made abstract sin concrete, and it let communities believe they were fighting something they could point to, catch, even kill. These beliefs were not exclusive to England. In continental Europe, particularly in Germany and France, similar ideas circulated, though the focus often shifted toward possession rather than companionship. In Scotland, familiars were woven into the broader tapestry of fairy lore, with witches said to receive them from the Queen of the Fairies, not Satan himself. But the structure remained. The animal becomes the servant becomes the sign becomes the sentence. In rare cases, animals were even executed alongside their owners. Cats were burned, dogs were drowned. The idea was not symbolic, it was literal purification. To destroy the body that held demonic energy, even in animal form, was a necessary act in the eyes of many communities. And so we return to the quiet cottage, the lonely room, the fire that barely warms the bones. A woman sits with a cat in her lap, and the entire world looks at her through a lens of fear. That creature, once a friend, is now a witness, perhaps even a judge. And in a society so desperate to find enemies in its midst, every shadow is suspect, every whisper has weight, and even love, soft, loyal animal love, becomes a danger. In the next subsegment, we'll shift our focus to the courtroom itself, to the testimonies, both forced and voluntary, that formed the heart of so many witch trials. What did people actually say? What did they believe they saw? Through trial records and witness statements, we'll explore how personal grievances, vivid dreams, and strange coincidences became fatal testimony in a world that had forgotten how to doubt.
Imagine a wooden bench in a crowded room, rough-hewn walls, a cold breeze leaking through the shutters, a clerk hunched over a ledger, dipping his quill into ink that smells of iron, and in front of him, a woman, trembling, accused, not of murder, not of theft, but of something more spectral, less visible. She is charged with maleficium, the crime of magic, and the evidence about to be presented, a dream, a vision, a memory, a grudge dressed in spiritual language. In the courtroom of a 17th-century witch trial, truth did not operate as we understand it today. It was not limited to what could be touched, measured, or verified. Instead, it bloomed from what was felt, feared, or imagined. The law did not require physical proof, only persuasive certainty, and in such an atmosphere, the line between accusation and belief, between memory and invention, all but disappeared. Let us begin with a common element, the testimony of neighbors. In many cases, trials began not with the discovery of some obvious crime, but with rumors, whispers that grew into statements. A child fell sick after passing a woman on the road. A cow gave sour milk. A crop withered despite good weather. And the common thread in all of it? Someone must be blamed. Misfortune, after all, could not be natural. In an age before germ theory or weather forecasting, the world seemed like a moral system. If something bad happened, someone had caused it. One of the most unsettling realities of these trials is that many of the witnesses genuinely believed what they were saying. These were not always malicious fabrications. Rather, they were stories grown from fear, suspicion, and a deep need for explanation. A man might claim that he saw an old woman muttering near his field just before a storm destroyed his wheat. A mother might insist that her infant began convulsing after accepting bread from a certain neighbor. These were stories rooted in coincidence, but repeated with conviction, they became damning. And then there were the dreams.
It's difficult to overstate how seriously dreams were taken in early modern Europe. To dream of someone was not merely to imagine them, it was, in some eyes, to encounter their spirit. Many witch trials contain records of dreams entered into evidence. People claimed to see the accused riding beasts, flying through the night, appearing in their homes as shadowy figures. One woman testified that she dreamt the accused entered her room and pressed upon her chest until she couldn't breathe. Another said she awoke to find the shape of the accused hovering over her bed, and then discovered bruises on her arms. These dreams were not dismissed as mere imagination. They were treated as visitations, spiritual evidence. The judges and magistrates did not always need to believe every detail. What mattered was the pattern. Enough testimony, even contradictory, could form a net tight enough to trap the accused, especially when the stories shared similarities, whether through collusion, coincidence, or the simple spread of rumor. We also find another curious element in these records: confession under strain. Many accused women confessed to impossible things. They described secret meetings in the woods, feasts with the devil, pacts sealed with blood. They claimed to fly, to conjure storms, to kill with a look. And while modern readers might assume such confessions were signs of delusion, they were more often the product of exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional. When imprisoned in dark, cold cells, isolated and interrogated for hours or even days, people broke, especially if they were told their salvation depended on telling the truth, or more accurately, the story the interrogators wanted to hear. In some places, confessions were induced through what we now understand as psychological torture, sleep deprivation, hunger, constant repetition of questions. In others, physical torture was used, the rack, thumb screws, or simply being kept in painful positions for long periods of time. And once a confession was extracted, it became the foundation for further arrests. The accused were often asked to name their accomplices. Each name given meant a new target, a new trial, a new spiral of fear.
Some records show the accused trying to retract their confessions later, claiming they were made under duress. But retractions were rarely accepted. Once a narrative had been established, the courts preferred to follow it to its conclusion. Doubt was dangerous. Mercy, even more so. Let us not forget the children. In some of the most harrowing testimonies, children were called to speak against their own mothers or neighbors. They repeated stories they'd heard whispered in the village. Some claimed to have seen animals change shape. Others said they were offered sweets in exchange for strange oaths. These children were not necessarily lying. They were often frightened, confused, or eager to please the adults around them. But their words carried tremendous weight, especially when those words aligned with adult fears. Trial records from places like East Anglia, Bamberg, and Salem all show a similar progression. Suspicion leads to accusation, accusation leads to confession, confession leads to execution. And all along the way, it is language, not evidence, that drives the machinery. Words become weapons, stories become sentences. But why did so many people participate in this process? Why did neighbors, friends, even family turn against one another? One answer lies in social pressure. To be the one who spoke out first was to be seen as vigilant, moral, aligned with godliness. To remain silent might invite suspicion. And so people spoke, sometimes to protect themselves, sometimes to settle old grudges, and sometimes simply because they believed what they were saying. In a world without scientific certainty, people reached for spiritual logic. If a cow died unexpectedly, if a child grew sick, if bread failed to rise, these were not just unfortunate events. They were signs. The devil moved through the world not with horns and fire, but with whispers, glances, and invisible currents. And the courtroom became the place where those currents were named, judged, and punished. As we move toward our final subsegment of this chapter, we'll step away from the victims and look toward the other side of the bench, the judges, magistrates, and landowners who drove these trials forward. What motivated them? Was it fear, faith, or something quieter, colder, the calculated pursuit of land, power, and wealth? Imagine a thick velvet curtain, not drawn across a stage, but across truth itself. Behind it sits not a monster, not a demon, but a man, a landowner, a judge, a local official in polished boots and stiff collar, scratching his signature into parchment by candlelight. The room smells of wax and old wood. Outside, the village sleeps uneasily. But here, decisions are made, not of guilt or innocence, but of ownership, inheritance, and fear disguised as justice.
By the mid-1600s, across many parts of Europe and the British Isles, the machinery of witch trials had grown larger than belief alone. While superstition and religious fervor were the flames, they were increasingly fanned by something colder: property, status, the quiet hunger for land and control. In this final subsegment of Segment 3, we explore how trials, even the most absurd, surreal, or tragic, were not simply mass delusions, but often carefully manipulated processes that served the ambitions of the powerful. To understand this, consider the position of many accused women. They were widows, spinsters, healers, midwives, often childless, often landowners in their own right, or in possession of property that might revert to the crown or a local landlord if they were executed. In some parts of Germany, more than half of all accused witches were women over 50 who lived alone. In England, similar patterns emerge: women who had small cottages, garden plots, or even minor debts owed to them. They were vulnerable not only to suspicion, but to quiet reorganization of wealth once they were gone. When a woman was executed for witchcraft, her possessions, no matter how modest, were often seized. Her home might be absorbed by a landlord, her animals, tools, or stored food redistributed or auctioned. In communities where land was the foundation of power, this meant that eliminating a marginal figure didn't just cleanse spiritual evil, it consolidated social hierarchy. Those who presided over the trials stood to benefit, not only in terms of prestige, but in tangible, economic ways.
This dynamic becomes clearest when we examine trial patterns. In towns where land disputes were frequent, witch accusations often spiked. A quarrel over a boundary line becomes a whispered story about a cursed field. A long-standing debt transforms into a claim that a borrower's child fell ill after a visit. The accused might be the same person who refused to sell a parcel of land, or who challenged a tax, or who helped a laborer seek better wages. The mechanisms of the trial disguised a deeper game, one that used fear as leverage and piety as cover. Some judges, like those who served under Matthew Hopkins in East Anglia, were paid per conviction. Others gained favor with local authorities by cleansing communities of dangerous elements. And what was more dangerous to the fragile order of rural society than a woman who owned property without a man beside her, or who had knowledge of medicine, of childbirth, of legal rights that others didn't? Even religious language was sometimes bent to secular gain. Church courts operated alongside civil ones, and while both claimed spiritual authority, the outcomes were often material. A field changes hands. A family name is tarnished. A rival is eliminated, all without drawing a blade or starting a feud. Instead, the accusation does the cutting, the testimony does the bleeding, and the verdict seals it all with a wax stamp. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine the judges as fully corrupt, scheming men in wigs and cloaks, wringing their hands as they sign away lives. But reality, as always, is subtler. Many of these men believed in the law they administered. They were raised in the same systems, the same fears, the same doctrine of sin and retribution. What made them dangerous was not a cartoonish evil, but their confidence, the calm belief that they were upholding divine and social order, that their decisions, however harsh, preserved the balance of their world.
This made them less likely to listen to appeals, less open to doubt, and more eager to find pattern and guilt where there was only suffering and confusion. Their desks, polished by generations of elbows and paperwork, became altars, not to truth, but to the smooth function of a society that needed its outsiders marked and removed. In the trial of Elizabeth Clark, for instance, one of the first major cases under Matthew Hopkins, the woman was elderly, disabled, and already marginal. Her confession, extracted after sleep deprivation and pressure, led to the arrest of others, but it also left her tiny cottage vacant. Her chickens, her few possessions were taken. There is no record of where they went, no inventory filed, just a disappearance, not only of a woman, but of her entire presence in the community. This erasure is one of the most chilling legacies of the trials. Unlike dramatic executions or burning stakes, these quiet disappearances leave almost no trace, no blood, no monument, just an empty chair, a closed door, a garden gone to weeds. And in the ledger books of the gentry, a new line item, a new claim. In this way, the trials were not just about fear, they were about power maintenance. They reminded the poor of their place, punished deviation from gender roles, and allowed communities to reset their hierarchies under the banner of righteousness. The woman who spoke too loudly, who brewed strange teas, who refused a marriage match. She was not just different, she was dangerous. And in court, that danger could be trimmed like a branch, neatly, legally, permanently. So we must remember, the witch was not always a sorceress or a healer, or even a victim of superstition. Sometimes she was simply in the way. In the next segment, we'll widen our lens. From the dusty courtrooms and icy prison cells, we'll move upward into the homes and chambers of the very people who signed the orders and enjoyed the fruits of their cleansing. Segment 4 will explore the lives of the elite, the judges, landowners, and gentlemen who issued proclamations from polished desks and enjoyed the fruits of their cleansing. We'll contrast the brutality of the witch trials with the quiet, luxurious certainty of those who never had to fear accusation, because they wrote the rules.
Imagine yourself in a warm, wood-panelled room, far from the draughty cell where an accused woman might wait for dawn. Here the fire crackles steadily, casting dancing shadows on the shelves lined with law books and ledgers. A silver inkpot gleams in the candlelight, and seated behind the desk is a man, not a monster, not a zealot, but a gentleman, calm, educated, wealthy. His clothes are fine, his hands are soft, and his decisions lethal. To truly understand the witch trials of the 17th century, we must step into rooms like these. Not because this is where spells were cast or demons invoked, but because this is where power was exercised with quill and wax, not flame and pitchfork. This subsegment explores the social architecture that enabled the witch hunts to flourish, how landowners, magistrates, and local elites quietly built and protected their power by manipulating fear, shaping justice, and turning suspicion into a weapon of order. The gentry, that is, the landowning upper class just below the nobility, played an outsized role in rural life across England and much of Europe during this period. They held authority not merely through inheritance, but through proximity. They oversaw justice, collected taxes, lent money and employed labourers. Their homes sat apart from the villages, often perched atop hills or tucked behind walls, but their influence extended into every cottage and field below. Many of the men who authorized or encouraged witch trials came from this class. They were not clergymen, though they often worked in tandem with the church, nor were they soldiers or kings. They were, by modern standards, landlords with legal powers. They acted as justices of the peace, local magistrates, or appointed commissioners. When a rumour of witchcraft reached their ears, they were often the first line of institutional response, not to offer comfort, but to initiate a process.
Why? The reasons were rarely explicit. These men did not stand in the village square shouting about demons. They rarely gave public sermons on sin. Instead, they relied on discretion, decorum, and deeply held assumptions about the fragility of order. To them, unrest was contagion. Any hint of rebellion, social, spiritual, or economic, had to be checked. And what more symbolic challenge to order than a woman outside the usual bounds? A widow with land, a healer with respect, a poor tenant who dared to challenge rent. One tool in their arsenal was the law itself. Witchcraft statutes were vague, broad, and unevenly enforced, but they provided a convenient legal net to cast when other accusations, theft, sedition, heresy, were too volatile. Accusing someone of bewitching a cow or causing a miscarriage didn't require strong proof. It required fear and a few willing witnesses. Once the gears of accusation began turning, the accused was trapped, and the gentleman who set them in motion could often stay comfortably out of view. There is evidence that some trials were quietly initiated, not by the masses, but by whispers among the elite. Correspondence from the period shows landowners warning one another about disturbers of peace, clever women, or rootless widows. These phrases didn't name crimes, they named risks. And in a world where social order was brittle, such risks were enough to justify legal intervention. These interventions often intersected with issues of property. A tenant farmer who owed back rent might suddenly accuse his elderly neighbour of casting a curse. A landowner looking to consolidate fields might find support for a case against a woman whose herbal garden stood in the way. Once the accused was convicted or executed, the redistribution of assets could begin, all under the pretense of public safety and religious purity. Of course, not every landowner was scheming. Many were sincerely convinced of the reality of witchcraft. They had read treatises, attended sermons, and lived through years of war, disease, and famine, conditions that cried out for explanation. Witchcraft offered a convenient scapegoat, and punishing it gave the illusion of control in a chaotic world. But the sincerity of belief does not erase the material gains. Whether consciously exploited or unconsciously reinforced, the system benefited those already in power.
The private lives of these men were a world apart from those they judged. While accused women endured the cold, the rats, the chains of prison, the gentlemen dined in panelled halls, discussed estate boundaries, arranged marriages, and planned fox hunts. Their days were orderly, reinforced by servants and traditions, unshaken by the public suffering that justified their authority. Their nights were quiet, their beds warm, and when they thought of the witch trials, it was often in terms of duty, grim necessity, not personal cruelty. One might ask, did they sleep soundly? Some surely did. Others may have felt a creeping discomfort. Diaries from the period occasionally reveal unease, a mention of the old woman's eyes, or a dream, or a lingering question about a confession that came too easily. But these were not enough to stop the system, because ultimately the trials were not about belief, they were about structure, about keeping the world in its place. In their minds, the accused were not simply punished, they were erased to preserve balance. And from the vantage point of the judge's desk, that erasure looked like peace. As we move to the next sub-segment, we will step through the doors of these houses, the elite estates and gentlemen's manors, and see how the very architecture of comfort was built on quiet fear, how draperies and candlelight, fine china and family portraits were not separate from the world of the accused, but intimately connected to it. In these halls, where power was inherited and reinforced, the witch hunts did not appear as horror, but as housekeeping.
Picture a corridor lined with portraits. Each one is a variation of the same pose. A man or woman seated with composure, surrounded by books, dogs, or tapestries, symbols of learning, leisure, and lineage. Their eyes, painted with oil and varnish, seem to gaze through time. These were not witches. They were never accused, and they never would be. This sub-segment guides us gently through the quiet, immaculately ordered homes of the elite in 17th century England, the very people who directed, permitted, or benefited from the witch trials, but lived in a world untouched by suspicion. The gentry and upper middle classes in this era often lived in homes that feel, even now, distinctly removed from the chaos of the world outside. While villagers trudged through mud, fetched water from communal wells, and shared hearths with livestock, the homes of the landowning class had corridors for privacy, separate kitchens to keep away the smell of smoke and meat, and imported carpets or tapestries muffling the cold of stone floors. The air was filtered by beeswax candles. The windows, often lined with leaded glass, were small, but they gave a filtered view of a world they quietly governed. Here, the rhythms of the day were anchored by ritual. Morning prayers in the study, correspondence at the writing desk, a midday meal prepared by others and served without questions. The conversation might drift to politics, to the harvest, to a neighbour's unruly tenants. It might mention the recent accusation in the village, but only as a matter of concern or inconvenience, rarely guilt. And this detachment was not accidental. It was the product of centuries of tradition, architectural choices, social etiquette, and sheer distance, not just physical distance from the village, but emotional and psychological space. The elite lived behind hedgerows and low stone walls, often just a field or two away from their tenants, yet worlds apart in perception. They understood superstition in the abstract. They read about demons in books, but they were not vulnerable to gossip. Their reputations were insulated. Their eccentricities were framed as character, not danger.
If a young woman in the village spoke too confidently, she might be labelled dangerous.
If a lady of the manor studied Latin or read medical texts, she was considered accomplished. A village healer might be accused of tampering with life and death. A gentleman experimenting with herbal tonics or astrology was indulging in enlightened curiosity. In both cases, herbs were crushed and candles lit, but only one was punished. This asymmetry was more than hypocrisy. It was the invisible engine of social order. The trials below reaffirmed the safety above. By marking the poor and marginal as spiritually suspect, the elite reinforced their own moral superiority. The witch hunts did not simply remove threats, they broadcast messages. We are the guardians of reason. We are the keepers of tradition. We are above suspicion. Inside the homes of the powerful, evidence of this certainty accumulated. Bookshelves displayed religious texts and legal treatises, many of which justified the punishment of witches as part of maintaining godly order. Portraits often included iconography suggesting virtue, wisdom, and legacy. And above all, these homes were quiet. No crowds gathered at their gates, no curses were whispered against their windows. Their peace was paid for by noise elsewhere, by screams in the courtroom, by gossip in the lanes, by silence in the prison. It's important to understand that many of these homes also served as administrative centers. The gentleman who passed judgment on a suspected witch might do so in the same room where he balanced estate accounts or settled disputes between tenants. The desk at which he sentenced a woman to hang was not marked by blood or fear, but by polished oak, inkwells, and the smell of dried lavender. The horror of the trial was hidden behind the ritual of paper and law. This made it easier to distance the consequence from the cause.
Even their servants, maids, butlers, stewards, absorbed this perspective. They might hear stories, or even see an accused woman brought to the estate for questioning, but they learned quickly the rules of silence and separation. One did not speak of such things at supper. One did not question a master's judgment. And so, within those walls, history hardened into routine. There were, of course, exceptions. A few dissenters among the gentry spoke out against the trials. Some ministers and reformers began to challenge the evidentiary standards of witchcraft accusations, arguing that confession under duress and spectral evidence were unreliable. But these voices were quiet, scattered, and often ignored. They spoke from within a system designed to listen only when it wished. What makes these homes haunting in hindsight is not what they contain, but what they omit. In inventories of estate property, we find lists of clocks, tableware, books, and linen. Rarely do they mention the lives touched by their owner's decisions. There is no line for woman hanged at suggestion, no entry for child orphaned by verdict. The violence of the trials left no mark on the mahogany. And yet, if one listens closely, the silence speaks. The stillness of those rooms, the quiet dinners, the warm fires, the gentle creak of a chair as a gentleman stands to sign a death warrant. That silence holds a kind of complicity, not loud, not theatrical, but enduring. In the next subsegment, we will turn to the ledger itself, to the way land changed hands, to the unspoken agreements and property claims that often followed an execution. We will look at the cold arithmetic behind the flames and how quiet greed, wrapped in legal paper and sealed with wax, shaped not just the fate of witches, but the map of rural England.
Now imagine the moment after the sentence, not the execution, not the crowd, but the quiet day that follows. The house once occupied by the accused woman stands still. The shutters are closed, the fire long gone cold. There are no heirs, at least none with power, no husband to defend her name, no sons to dispute the judgment. And so that little home, those 4 goats, that half-acre of usable pasture, suddenly they belong to someone else. This subsegment explores the afterlife of a witch trial, not in myth, but in property. Because for every trial that ended with a rope or a stake, there was an inheritance unsettled, a tenancy disrupted, a claim reopened. Behind the religious fervour and communal panic, there existed a quieter, more enduring motive: land. Rural England in the 1600s was not a world of sprawling estates and endless pastures for everyone. Most people, especially women, lived precariously. Widows in particular occupied a narrow legal space. They often lived on land that technically belonged to a deceased husband's family or was rented from a landlord. Some held tiny freeholds, small plots passed down over generations, barely enough to sustain a life, but enough to be worth claiming if the holder were suddenly gone. The legal doctrine of escheat allowed land without a rightful heir to revert to the local lord or the crown. But in practice, it wasn't always about legal formalities. It was about who showed up to claim what remained. In a time before centralized land registries, local memory mattered, reputation mattered. And so, when a woman was labeled a witch, her social erasure often preceded her legal one. Her name, now tainted, no longer inspired defense. No one wanted to speak for her, and that silence opened doors. Sometimes it was neighbors who stepped in. A fellow tenant might quietly extend their boundary fence, grazing their animals on new grass. Sometimes it was family, distant cousins or remarried sons who saw opportunity in shame. But often it was the local gentry or church who absorbed the property into larger holdings, justifying the action as moral cleanliness, clearing the land of evil, restoring order.
We have records, scattered but telling, of property transfers that followed witch trials. A 1646 estate inventory in Essex notes the reassignment of a thatched cottage formerly of Goodwife H to the parish. In Lancashire, land once worked by an accused healer was repurposed by a local squire as part of an orchard expansion. These changes didn't make headlines. They weren't publicized, but they happened. And they reshaped the landscape of rural power in slow, invisible increments. It's worth noting that many of the accused were not destitute. While the poorest were vulnerable to accusation, those with even modest property were also at risk, because they had something to lose. A widow who refused to remarry, who held on to land and maintained independence, could become a target not only of envy, but of quiet ambition. In some cases, accusations of witchcraft coincided suspiciously with ongoing land disputes.
A neighbor claims their livestock fell ill and also happens to be in the middle of a fence line argument with the accused. A relative claims to have been cursed and also wants a share of inheritance denied to them. These overlaps weren't always malicious, but they were convenient. The label of witch served as a social and legal eraser. Once applied, it nullified normal claims of justice. Who would defend a witch's rights? This pattern wasn't limited to England. Across early modern Europe, the link between witch trials and property redistribution appears again and again. In parts of Germany, entire villages saw dramatic shifts in ownership following waves of executions. In Scotland, lairds expanded their domains under the cover of moral purification. Even in colonial New England, Salem's land disputes played a quiet role in fueling the flames. This wasn't a conspiracy in the modern sense. There were no master plans drawn on parchment. No one said aloud, "Let's accuse her so we can take her field." But the logic of the system rewarded those who looked the other way, who failed to question, who stood to gain. It was a form of structural greed, embedded not in greediness, but in opportunity.
Sometimes the gain wasn't land, but influence. Removing a difficult tenant created room for a more compliant one. Eliminating a healer made space for a male physician aligned with the church. Silencing an outspoken widow calmed a community growing uneasy with her independence. The trials served as pruning, quiet, ruthless trimming of social branches that grew in the wrong direction. And so, over the course of a generation, the landscape changed. Fields changed hands, trees were cut, gardens were dug under, homes were repainted or left to rot. A woman's death might seem a singular tragedy, but the pattern formed a mosaic. One by one, lives were erased, and in their absence, power congealed, gently, quietly, enduringly. What's haunting is how little this was recorded. Legal documents speak of rightful inheritance, of community restoration, of pious acts. Rarely do they mention the trial. The word witch disappears once the execution is complete. The paperwork is sterile. The ink is black. The law moves on. As we step into the final subsegment of this segment, we'll shift our focus from these acts of quiet redistribution to the worldview that allowed them. We'll sit once more at the judge's desk, not to see what he took, but to understand what he believed. Because sometimes the most enduring injustice is committed not by those who know they are wrong, but by those convinced they are right.
He sat at a desk, perhaps oak, perhaps cherry wood, burnished with use. Its surface bore the marks of a life spent in writing, deep grooves where a quill had pressed too hard, dark circles from inkpots long evaporated, the faint scratch of sand for drying. This was the judge. He was not a villain, at least not in the way stories would prefer. He believed in what he was doing, and that made everything worse. This subsegment is not about blood or torture or fire. It's about the mind that authorized them and then returned to supper with a clear conscience. It's about the comfort of law, the serenity of procedure, and the way history's most enduring injustices were committed by those who considered themselves upright. To understand the witch trials, we must understand that many of the people involved, judges, magistrates, clerks, genuinely believed they were defending society. These were not men frothing at the mouth or cackling over cruelty. They were men of property, men of books, often men of the church. They read treatises, they consulted scripture. They believed deeply in the order of the world, an order in which witches did exist, and in which their eradication was necessary. Witchcraft, in their eyes, was not just a crime, it was treason against the divine, a disruption of God's plan. And when you believe the stakes are that high, doubt becomes dangerous. Certainty becomes a shield. Inside their chambers, the logic seemed sound. Witnesses came forward. Old grievances were dressed in new robes. A cow's death became a curse. A child's fever became a visitation. The accused was poor, odd, isolated, and in a time of tension, that was enough. The judge then merely translated communal fear into formal judgment. He was not the storm, just its funnel.
He had help. Legal manuals circulated widely in the 17th century. One of the most influential was Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written more than a century earlier, but still invoked. It provided structure, precedent, authority. If the devil could take many forms, if witches bore marks upon their skin, if dreams could carry evidence, then the judge could act. Not on instinct, but on framework. He didn't invent the rules, he enforced them. And enforcement gave comfort. Each trial followed procedure. Oaths were taken, testimonies heard, records kept. The condemned were offered the chance to confess. The process mimicked fairness, enough that those within it could sleep at night. What happened afterward in the square or at the gallows was no longer the judge's burden. The machinery of law had moved. His part was done. But let us pause here, because this is the heart of it. The soothing, devastating lie that process is justice, that following rules absolves responsibility. The judges were not brutes. They were, in many ways, gentlemen. They wrote letters to friends. They gave to the poor. They mourned their children when they died. But when seated behind that desk, cloaked in wig or robe, they allowed, again and again, human life to be erased by ritual. And they were thanked for it. Communities often celebrated these men. Their reputations rose. Their names were invoked as protectors. In some cases, their families profited, directly or indirectly, through land acquisition or increased influence. The judge who sentenced the healer might later be invited to dine at the newly reassigned estate, not as a thief, as an honored guest.
What makes this mindset so chilling is how familiar it feels. Even now, in quieter times, we construct systems that comfort the powerful and flatten the vulnerable. We build desks where judgments are made from far above. We write laws that appear neutral but act selectively. And always, we give ourselves the gift of believing we are righteous.
The 17th-century judge didn't twirl a moustache, he didn't leer over the gallows. He sat, pen in hand, and told himself he was preserving order, that the woman before him was dangerous, that her neighbors had spoken, that the books confirmed it, and that God approved. And so he signed. Then he pushed the paper aside. He folded his hands. He rang for tea. The same hand that signed the warrant might later pen a sermon, or hold a grandchild, or pluck a rose from the garden. And none of it felt like contradiction, because once evil is externalized, any act against it becomes virtue. This is why witch trials lasted as long as they did, not because of fire and screaming, but because of calm men in quiet rooms convincing themselves that what they did was necessary, justified, moral. As we come to the end of this segment, reflect on that desk. That desk still exists, in metaphor if not in wood. It lives in every structure that values rules over mercy, image over truth, comfort over courage. And behind it still sit people who believe, absolutely, that they are doing the right thing. They don't shout, they don't sneer, they speak softly, they nod, they write. And sometimes what they write ends a life.
The witch trials of the 1600s are often remembered for their spectacle. Bonfires and gallows, curses and confessions, mobs and madness. But those moments, loud and terrifying as they were, did not define the era. What lingered was quieter. It was the coldness of a door that no longer opened, the absence of a voice at the market, the unclaimed tools left in a shed, a vacancy that no one spoke of aloud. Tonight we have travelled through that quiet. We began with the woman watched by her neighbours, whose poverty and age made her suspect. We followed her into the machinery of accusation and pain, into a world where truth bowed to fear, and fear served the interests of those already powerful. We examined the evidence, so-called, and saw how dreams, scars, animals, and silence could all be turned against a person. We saw how those with the most to lose, land, independence, respect, were often the first to be condemned. And then we sat behind the judge's desk. We did not find a monster there. We found something far more unsettling. A man convinced of his own virtue. A man guided by law, by scripture, by social order. A man who never questioned whether the rules he followed were written for justice or merely for control.
That, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson. The trials were not storms of chaos. They were systems of calm violence. They were woven into the routines of church and court, of town and household. They were normalized, institutionalized, and they were profitable, not always in coins, but in power, in land, in reputation. The death of one woman might be a line in a ledger, a footnote in a diary, but multiplied across years and counties and countries, the pattern becomes unmistakable. What's chilling is not just that it happened, it's that it made sense to them, that it followed rules, that it felt right. We like to think we are past such things, that superstition and paranoia no longer shape the fates of individuals, that accusations cannot strip a life so easily. But look closer at the ways we other, the ways we watch, the ways we judge from comfortable distance, at how quickly a whisper becomes a verdict when it serves someone's interest. Witch trials no longer look like they did in the 1600s, but the instincts, the fear of difference, the hunger for control, the comfort of procedure, still live quietly beneath the surface, in every system, in every age.
And so, as you drift off tonight, let your mind walk slowly away from the square, past the blackened stake and the silent judge's chambers, through the alleys of a village that no longer speaks of what happened. Let it pause at the small cottage with the empty hearth. Let it see the chair that's still tucked neatly under the table, the herb jars long dried, the space left behind. Then let it go, let it fade. History is heavy, but sleep is kind. And somewhere, beyond the noise of judgment and the echo of old laws, there is rest. Good night, and thank you for listening. Narrated by Boris, for Boring Boris History. Let the past whisper, so the present may sleep.